All right, welcome to the Sweet Science of Fighting podcast. Today we have Gary Hutt. Welcome, Gary.
Thanks for having me, James.
Thanks for coming on. You seem to roll in similar circles to a lot of other guests that I've had on this podcast, so obviously you're a perfect fit there, and especially since you're leading the program there with Great Britain Boxing. But do you want to provide a brief background about yourself for anyone listening who's not sure of who you are?
Yeah, great. So my background hasn't necessarily been in combat sport, but I've been with GB Boxing now for about 4 years. Before that, I've worked in, like a lot of S&C coaches have, in a lot of different channels across higher education or in a private facility which I used to own, as well as with NGBs around the UK. So broad kind of multi-sport background really, and I try and apply that to the boxers now. Nice.
Obviously, coming from multiple sports as well, you get a kind of a look at a lot of different things and get to apply a lot of different things too. So it tends to be an advantage anyway. But I wanted to dive into, at least to start this podcast, amateur versus pro boxing. Obviously, we have some obvious differences, number of rounds fought, but there are some other more subtle differences within the two disciplines. So do you want to maybe dive into, I guess, these differences between amateur and pro boxing and how you would go about preparing each fighter if there is some kind of difference there?
Yeah, brilliant. So, I mean, obviously, fundamentally, from boxing, I think it's just important to outline what the amateur code looks like and when we're competing. So our guys are doing 3-3-minute rounds. That's both for men and for women. And obviously that's a fairly important distinction on the women's side, particularly when you're thinking about the shift into pros. I guess the other key difference between amateurs and pros is that to win an Olympic medal, our guys will have to do 2 competitions, 1 qualifier and 1 Olympic Games. Usually they'll have to box 4 or 5 times across a, say, 10 to 14 day period. So there's an element where weight making is completely different between pros and amateurs, but also being able to kind of repeatedly perform at a really intense high level and recover and then go again and again and again is important. Now, like you said, there's a few clear differences. I mean, one of the obvious ones that I think is important to consider when you're prepping an amateur boxer versus a pro boxer is the kind of the stoppage rate within amateurs. Now, like you'll know, James, and most people who are involved in the sports will know that stoppages aren't regular in amateur. I think the stat is that there's about 6% of bouts end in a stoppage. So from the point of view of a strength and conditioning coach, we've got perhaps a lower focus on those metrics of physicality that leads to stoppages, because the guys are winning in a technical way more often than not. So I know for me, like, our prioritization within the training environment is very much focused towards kind of boxing being the key training stimulus. But then conditioning of the boxers is fundamental, and I definitely describe our team as like a big C, little s kind of coaching team. And then we bring in the strength piece to kind of look after the boxers from an injury prevention or as much as we can point of view, and then lean into some of the performance enhancement stuff. But we really, really dive into the kind of the style of the boxer and get dictated to by that as to how we try and push them forward.
Do you want to maybe dive into a little bit of that about the style of the boxer, kind of what the different styles are, and then I guess the differences in preparation between those different styles?
So we take a really broad brush approach and think, well, a key judging criteria will be dominance in the bout. And if you've got a front foot boxer who wants to push forward and take space and put somebody under pressure, they'll require a very different physicality than a back foot fighter who's looking to open up space and create opportunities to be able to kind of land really clean shots. One will throw a lot more punches often than the other. One will do a lot more moving around the ring, but perhaps land or throw less punches, but be more accurate. And because when you look across the research in amateur boxing, like, it's one of the fundamental things that I think is really important to consider is the fact that we're operating on a proxy all the time. So we never actually, like you can see the rings in the background, there's very few ways to actually track what's going on in the ring, as you know, from a pure research point of view. We can't strap a face mask on to gas analyse somebody who's getting punched in the face. And that's where I've connected with some of your previous guests before, like Andrew Usher, who's doing some really interesting things in the kind of muscle deoxygenation and looking at peripheral conditioning. But also, like from a mechanics point of view, all of the research is based in kind of sterile max punch on a bag, on a force plate. And there's only a certain amount of that you can really take to applying in the ring. It gives you a good guideline, but perhaps not exactly what's happening all the time. So the way that we try and approach it is consider that style for the boxer. And I mean, I'd be interested to know about your history actually, and with the fighters that you've worked with, like when they come into you, and often we're dealing with people who are elite boxers that have a very poor strength and conditioning background.
Yeah, usually.
And but then some of our guys have got absolutely elite physical qualities before they start doing any physical training with us. Yeah. So things like I'm very, very fortunate across the last 14 years. GB Boxing have been very consistent in their testing battery. So I've got 14 years of world-class boxing data to be able to look back on and try and understand and interpret. And something like a drop jump is really interesting because we've got guys that are like, our average guys will be hitting over four on an RSI.
Holy shit.
Without having trained a physical quality in the gym.
Yeah.
So the boxing stimulus must be creating this like physical adaptation. I think our strategy around supporting in-ring performance is perhaps a little novel compared to a lot of the normal approaches with S&C, where I know when I first started coaching, I would look at a testing battery of an athlete's kind of physical characteristics and look at, well, what isn't quite up to scratch, what isn't good enough at the moment, and then try and fill those holes. So it's almost like a bottom-up approach, trying to push people forward, but not really touching on the things that were already a good level. In GB, we try and take the point of view of, well, what are the super strengths that those athletes have developed through their boxing style? And how can we enhance those super strengths? Because they must have developed them through their boxing. So if we can enhance those, we can draw a transfer into the sport through specific adaptation to style-based development. And I think that was something that was quite novel initially when I first came into GB Boxing. Now, going back to the original question, because we sidetracked a little bit there, so sorry.
No, it's good.
The difference is actually for me between pro and amateur, like perhaps the intensity is a little bit higher in the amateurs, so the tempo of the bout, because it's only 3 rounds, they can go a bit harder. The reliance on the strength element is perhaps a little lower in the amateurs than it might be in the pros, but in general, I think they're very, very similar sports, and I don't really distinguish too much between them. I mean, have you worked with many female athletes, James?
No, I have one back in my academy back home in New Zealand, but no. When I was mainly within rugby and rugby league, I was working with female rugby league at the New Zealand team there. So that's pretty much my extent with female athletes.
And I think it's a really interesting and growing area in combat sports, particularly boxing, really, where from a physiology point of view, there is a really interesting distinguished difference between like 6, 8, 10 2-minute rounds and 3 3-minute rounds. I feel like the physiology involved in both of those things is drastically different. And on the female side, they're almost able to keep a higher intensity because of the work to rest ratios involved than in the amateurs.
Interesting. I actually wanted to come back to your point about focusing on the super strength as well. So you gave the example of some boxers having an RSI of 4. So if anyone listening, 4 is damn high for reactive strength, essentially, measure. Would you then still be looking to improve that measure, I guess, above 4 to continue their physical development?
So we'd look at, and obviously this becomes a little bit of a conversation around how we analyse and understand jumping. And one of the sports I previously worked with, and I was fortunate to spend quite a little bit of time with, was volleyball. So we got quite comfortable with interpreting and looking into jump data. And there's some really good stuff coming from like a few Canadian researchers and a few of the guys in the UK around how we can interpret force data to inform decision making in S&C. But I kind of posed the question: how are these boxers going about achieving those really high RSIs? And effectively, we've got one common strategy and one uncommon strategy. A lot of our guys are really good at creating stiffness around the ankle, so their contact times in their RSI are driven really, really low. Like the fastest I've seen is like a 120 contact time off the floor, which is rapid. Now, on the whole, our guys will get to about a 150 and be able to put out some good height with that.
That's still damn quick.
Yeah, so I mean, we always discuss around cut-offs with the testing, but really it allows us to interpret, okay, these guys are able to create stiffness around the ankle and transfer force around the ankle pretty well. Some of them are then able to use hip and knee torque and apply it to the ankle really well to get a really good jump height. Some of them struggle with that a little bit more, and that tends to kind of split with style. So we'll have a group of guys that we might focus on hip and knee torque. We'll have a group of guys where we might focus on ankle stiffness or creating a better ability to transfer force around the ankle, and try and group our athletes in that way.
Nice. I like that idea of ankle stiffness as well. Do you want to maybe dive, because I know listeners can benefit from some practical tips and advice on that too. So do you want to maybe just dive into just quickly what ankle stiffness is and then how you go about developing that? Okay.
So we try and go super simple as possible and think around transfer of force. So our guys are on the balls of their feet all the time, and what that stimulus, or at least what we think that stimulus provides training for, is being able to transfer force effectively around that ankle in the most efficient way possible. So trying to create efficiency, leaning towards more elastic tenderness and force transfer rather than muscular force generation. The way that we go about training it, we use a few different, not even novel approaches. We try and rely on isometrics quite a lot, and plyometrics, particularly fast, rapid eccentric plyos, to be able to build our programming around developing stiffness qualities around the ankle. For some of the guys who we're comfortable with their ability to do that, we might then try and build up ability to generate torque around the knee and hip to take advantage of that stiffness around the ankle.
Nice. Do you want to maybe provide just a couple of, I guess, exercise examples that you would use for that?
Mm-hmm. So we might use like a bent knee or a straight knee isometric calf hold. So single leg or double leg, depending on how we're trying to attack the load in, but that'll tend to be more around like a super maximal or maximal isometric, like a pushing isometric rather than a holding isometric. And I know there's like a lot of different terminology that gets banged around with all of that.
Yeah.
I listened to your podcast. I can't remember who your guest was, but talked through a lot of isometric training.
Yeah, Dustin Orange.
Brilliant. Yeah, brilliant. Listen, so if anybody's listening, then I'd definitely refer back to that one. But yeah, so very, very simplistic kind of bent knee and straight knee calf raise or calf hold positions. We'll bring the duration of those down pretty low, so like 6 to 10 seconds. And and get the loading on those pretty high. We'll sometimes jump on the leg press to do that as well if you've got facility to do that. And then lots of hopping, bounding type foot contacts on the floor. We'll do that in gym-based sessions, but I also think we use a lot of sprint training.
Okay.
So we'll get our guys sprinting at least once a week, just because of that idea of ankle stiffness and transfer of force through the body into the floor in those really quick contact times.
Nice. How far do you have them sprint?
In a pure speed session, we'll do anything from kind of 20-meter accelerations through to 60-meter race scenario. We're really very lucky in the training space we've got over in Sheffield, where we've got an indoor track which we can have full access to in the mornings. So we've got a 60-meter straight, which is like very uniform. For guys who are training at home outside, or in a space where they haven't got such kind of nice indoor facilities, we use our sprinting in two ways. We'll look at acceleration-based sprints and full speed, high-speed running mechanics. We don't go into too much complexity because, we don't need to. And it becomes a very physical focus stimulus rather than technical focus. But what we're hoping to get back from that is purely training the body's ability to brace against applying force through the floor really quickly.
Nice. I know you wanted to touch on also stimulus versus adaptation when we're talking about training. Do you want to maybe dive into kind of what you mean by that?
Yeah, so when we're writing, I know as S&C coaches, when we're writing training programs, we focus on, particularly in the gym, what are we going to get back from the stimulus that we apply? And so we'll write a program for hypertrophy and put the training around what we know achieves some hypertrophy, or we'll put we'll have an objective of achieving power development or explosive strength development, and we'll write a training program that gears towards achieving those stimulus based on the research findings that we know work and our experience. I think it's a really interesting context to try and throw that onto the conditioning side, because sometimes I think that there's a real pitfall for people in terms of going along and following an adaptation-based approach to conditioning. So in general, what I'll hear fighters talk about is the type of training they do for conditioning rather than the stimulus that they're looking to get or the adaptation they're looking to get from that training. And something that we try and bracket all of our training around is the idea of, well, in the ring, we're hitting that VO2 max, kind of how well does the full system of your kind of cardiovascular and neuromuscular system work. But we don't necessarily kind of always understand what goes into that at any one point. And I think I was really fortunate to, when I was really early in my coaching career, come across Alex Wolf's recent applied practice within GB rowing. So it's probably 10 to 15 years ago now. And I always remember a presentation he delivered at an FA conference that I attended, where he kind of went through from mouth to muscle the path of oxygen and all of the potential bottlenecks for performance. I think that's really important to bear in mind because we do it really well, I think, as S&C coaches in the gym environment, but perhaps less well sometimes when it comes down to conditioning stimulus. So we build our programming very much, and Andrew Usher has lent into some of this and some of his ideas, but also the kind of traditional training approach of long, slow, steady miles. Like, why does that benefit the boxer? Why does short, explosive training benefit the boxer? What's the stimulus for conditioning that we get just from doing the sport training? And the way as an S&C coach I try and complement the sport training, as I say, within our hierarchy of boxing, conditioning and strength, is try and fill in the gaps or focus really pure stimulus through a training block. So what we might do sometimes if we're away from competition is make a decision for a particular boxer. Do we want to develop central kind of heart and lungs based adaptations, or do we want to prioritize more peripheral adaptations? How is the muscle using energy? How is it creating energy? How is it shuttling calcium? Can we make adaptations at a muscular level, and then gear our training as purely around that as we possibly can?
I think that kind of leads into our conditioning for the amateur box topic too. But I wanted to dive into the central versus peripheral adaptations, especially for the listeners as well. How are you, programming, and what are you prescribing when you're trying to target these heart and lung adaptations versus when you're trying to target these muscular adaptations when it comes to conditioning?
Well, I can reference out the muscular adaptations a little bit because you've spoken to Andrew, so there's some really stuff around. Short sprint intervals, high intensity work, and sometimes I think we end up talking in terminology with boxers and with coaches that isn't easy to understand. We talk about anaerobic and aerobic, and what I try and link it to is heavy legs feeling or out of breath feeling. And the training that makes your legs heavy is going to be training towards muscular adaptation. The training that makes you feel out of breath is going to adapt towards the heart and lungs based stuff. So long, steady interval based work or long, steady road work, a really nice low intensity might cause adaptations around, or does cause adaptations around blood volume, red blood cell count, perhaps to a lesser extent lung volume, but the way that we're transporting oxygen around the body, whatever mode that is, whether it's running, cycling, long, steady endurance-based work will give you those adaptations. On the flip side of it, what's the phrase? Buffering type sessions, where you're going absolutely maximum intensity efforts, lots of recovery opportunity, and then repeat it. I think there's a bit of a mixed and middle ground, interestingly, in the repeated sprint work that guys might do, where what we've seen with the boxers is a real drive towards kind of aerobic adaptation off of repeated short high intensity bursts of exercise, but with lower amounts of recovery. And we've seen quite a lot of crossover with the sport in that area. Like, if you're able to do some long endurance work really well, if you're able to do some high intensity sprint work really well, the boxers that are really good in the ring and fit in the ring tend to be the ones that are able to underpin their high intensity work with good quality aerobic and kind of oxygen transport adaptations.
Yeah, I think we've had a lot of similar messages throughout the different podcasts and on the website and stuff about that as well, which is great to be reinforced by you there. But I wanted to also go into the idea of the guys you work with, the full-time professionals, essentially, right?
Yeah, so, it's a semi-centralized program we run, so they're in with us Monday to Thursday, and then Thursday to Monday they're at their home clubs, so we get to see them kind of 3 or 4 days a week, but it's an intense full-time period with that. Nice,
yeah. So a lot of the listeners are probably aren't privileged to have that kind of setup where they're looked after every day of the week, just boxing. So I wanted to dive into just some questions and ideas about, like, guys you're working with versus maybe someone who's doesn't have that kind of, training setup, where maybe they're only training boxing 3-4 times a week, but they still want to compete and things like that. And I guess the first one within that is the structure of the week. So where does someone fit in these conditioning sessions? Because if someone's boxing 3 or 4 times a week, but they also work full time, can they fit in 1 or 2 extra sessions? What do they do in those sessions, and where does it fit?
No, that's a really good question. I think the first thing that I think is really important around that is understanding exactly what you're trying to chase at any one time. So again, coming back to that adaptation-based approach rather than stimulus-based approach, what is the thing that's going to make the difference in those two sessions? And then how can you be really efficient around the sessions you're already doing? So the real benefit of some of the peripheral conditioning work is that actually it doesn't take very long. I think Andrew talked about maybe 2 30-second efforts in a training session with a minute in between. So you're looking at a 2-minute training session. We've used that exact protocol based on his work off the back of boxing sessions and sparring, off the back of bag work. We've also used it off the back of gym sessions, like lifting sessions. So being efficient and fitting those sessions in is quite nice. The difficult piece is perhaps the long duration type sessions, the sexually based sessions, where you perhaps have to dedicate a little bit more time to developing those systems. But we're really fortunate at GB that we collaborate with the coaches really closely, and we can sometimes, with particular athletes, make adaptations to their boxing specific training which will lend towards that type of a stimulus. So I guess one of the key things is considering efficiency, like what is the adaptation you're looking to try and achieve, and can you tag things onto sessions, or can you adjust the emphasis in the sport training slightly? And by that I mean, well, instead of doing 5 threes on a bag with a 1 minute rest, how can we make that more peripherally focused? Well, we could go to a session we used to run was 6 20-second efforts at maximum full intensity, with a variation from 70, 50 and 30-second recovery between those efforts. So you're challenging that muscular peripheral end within the sporting context. Or could the boxing coach move a session from 3 minute to 4 minute bag rounds, go to 30-second recovery and make it a little bit more of an aerobic stimulus? Doesn't necessarily have to be adjustments based on competition prep and periodization in that way, but physical adaptation goals as well.
Nice. And I guess the follow-up question to that would be, in terms of where it's placed, let's just take, for example, someone has sparring sessions on a Friday. Where would these sessions fit in the week? Could you do some of these sessions? I think you mentioned you did some of them after sparring, but could you do these after sparring? Would you do them the day before? Is there almost like a general guideline that someone could follow where, don't do it at this time?
I don't think I'd want to do one of the peripheral sprint sessions before any kind of technical training. But the way that we try and I'm really fortunate, we've got a physiologist that works with us at GB Boxing, Jamie Mitchell, who's excellent. And we talk a lot about how can we ensure that the stimulus we're applying has the longest tail. So in our week, the boxer might come in and do a gym session on a Monday along with his boxing, a couple of sessions on a Tuesday and a Wednesday, and then the final session on the Thursday might be a spar. Now, we know if the boxer leaves with a particular stimulus at the end of the week and they've got a couple of rest days, that hormonal state that they're leaving with will have an opportunity to continue on. It won't be interfered with by another training session. So if we're really trying to kind of prioritize a certain physical stimulus, we'll try and make it the last thing they do before they have a couple of rest days. A good example is we might throw a 2 30-second max effort sprints on a bike in after the spar at the end of the week, if we think that's appropriate, and then that gives a longer tail for the body to kind of stew in the biochemical changes that occur with that training. Equally with the longer duration stuff, we'll try and position it away from the boxing work that our guys do on camp by doing it over the weekend. where they do have a little bit more time to step back and kind of stay with that training stimulus. Because over at GB, some of our guys on training camps will do 3 sessions in a day. So if we were to position it in the start of that day, the interference of like adaptation that they'll get through the day will potentially drown out the adaptation that they experience. For your guys, the guys that are working at home, it's just I guess thinking about when's the opportunity to adapt going to happen, and trying to almost take a reverse point of view on how we'd usually perhaps program a week of, well, how the most important session from a physical point of view should perhaps have the longest recovery after, or have enough opportunity to recover effectively after that session.
Yeah, so if you're training like Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, Tuesday would be like your hard session, then you have Wednesday to recover. Yeah,
and then you might finish with a Friday hard session as well.
Yeah. Gotcha. I also wanted to get your thoughts on general versus specific conditioning within boxing. I know for you guys are boxing often, so you probably use a lot of different, I guess, general modalities, bike, running, whatever it is. You also mentioned heavy bag intervals as well, but I wanted to get your take for someone, for example, the example I gave, who's maybe only boxing 3-4 times a week. I guess how much of that time outside of boxing would you recommend they do their conditioning with boxing modalities versus trying to essentially just attack the physiology through something that's easy to do with, for example, on the bike or something like that?
I think part of the answer to that question probably comes from what is your current physical state, like what is your current physical fitness level, and what is your kind of approach to trying to be a good boxer or a good combat athlete. Like if you're fitness driven in the way that you try and approach your fighting, then actually you're probably in a good place to be able to get a lot of the conditioning needs met within sport specific situations. But I think, again, I'll be interested to hear what your thoughts are on this. One of the contentions that we have sometimes in that setting is sparring is the peak, pinnacle kind of physical stimulus within the sport. But to do sparring well, you have to be operating submax, because there's a decision-making element, and as soon as you're pushed up to your limit, decision-making will always start to fail, and you won't be able to be as effective as you could be in the sport. So there's an inherent kind of problem with gaining all of your conditioning needs from sparring, because you never perhaps push to the limit in sparring, or at least in a perfect world, because obviously people do get put outside their comfort zone. But if you're the fittest boxer, you shouldn't get put outside of your comfort zone. So there's perhaps a decision-making element there where it's like, am I a really, really fit animal? Am I trying to push really hard am I able to push really hard in the sparring, or in the kind of sport-specific training? Or am I less fit, and perhaps I need to get my fitness hit from other modes to make sure that the quality is there and I'm being pushed as hard as I need to be? Then for me, I'm always thinking about kind of how can I make the stimulus as pure as possible towards either central adaptive or peripheral adaptive, because I know that the sport is covering that middle ground of kind of VO2 max. So I'd always be kind of considering, well, the problem with specific conditioning is it can't be pure. Like, it's very difficult to create a really pure like anaerobic or peripheral stimulus in a sport-specific setting. It's really, really easy to do it in a general setting. So am I trying to achieve a pure like physiological adaptation, or am I trying to work on a mixed mode, full system? How does the body function and work together to get the training output I'm looking for? And from a conditioning point of view purely, I'll tend to bias towards making it as pure as possible by doing it as a non-specific modality. Now, the perhaps flip side of that is the strength element, and we focused a lot on conditioning, but perhaps not so much on strength. But with the strength element, I think the most specific and effective and usable strength training within boxing is being able to hit a bag really hard, hit something really hard, because of the coordination pattern, the joint angle specificity, all of the force generation requirements are so specific to the sport. But we'll then build our S&C program around being quite non-specific and building the musculature to be able to achieve that task really well. So, I mean, one question as a non-combat sport guy coming into boxing was like, why do boxers have big lats? Like, you look around and every single boxer I've ever met has massive lat wings, yeah. But it's a push sport. Like, so why would the lats get developed? And it took me a little while to really understand like that the lats play a secondary role in stabilising the spine. So on contact, if we're thinking about double peak EMG and like stiffening on contact, the lats are playing a really important role every shot to be able to stabilise the spine or trunk to be able to apply force. So if that's the case, if I can develop the kind of the muscles in the lats, the strength, their ability to apply force, I should be able to improve the impact forces on a shot. So we'll do perhaps some heavy bag punches in the sporting environment, and the coaches handle that more than I do really. But in the gym, we might spend good time making sure that the stimulus we're applying to the lats is really appropriate to be able to develop that strength characteristic and understand its place within the sporting movement.
Yeah, before we dive into that strength stuff, that's actually really interesting to hear what you're saying, because Seth Lenetsky was on the podcast not too long ago, and he said exactly the same thing as what you did when he was talking about boxers should spend more time essentially doing alactic power work on the bag or something, 6-second hard efforts to develop that strength within boxing. And then he also mentioned about the lats and how he has his boxers just hammer the lats in the gym because of that reason, but also because of the fact just that pull back from the punch and being able to throw combinations there. So, yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the same thing.
It's I've probably based some of my decision making on some of the research that Seth has done, and one of the difficulties, I guess, is like I say, there's no perfect way to measure punch force, and I'd love to see like a full biomechanics makeup of like ground reaction force, EMG, camera setup. Hopefully I keep cajoling. The reason I operate in all of these circles in the UK is that I keep cajoling all of the researchers to try and get them to link together to do something like that. So if any of them are listening, come and shout me. But I think that there's a real like important piece around strength and conditioning, particularly sport specific strength training, in understanding what is going on in the sport and what are the key movers and what are the key stabilizers, and how are we then trying to train those muscle groups in that ability to achieve that. The flip side of it is obviously if we wail on the lats too much, we get postural change that makes injury risk or increases injury risk. So you're walking a fine line between being able to generate that strength development without losing good quality movement patterns. And I mean, we've got quite a few guys historically that have kind of had real bad shoulder issues in boxing, dislocations from almost nothing within the sport, and making sure that the guy's shoulder's safe while still being able to develop the strength and strength characteristics that we really want is one of the kind of key challenges we see.
Yeah, I wanted to dive into, it's a very general question, but how does, I guess, a strength training session look for your guys?
Okay, so as I say, I see it as a tertiary priority in what we do. Every single guy in our gym still does two lifting sessions a week, potentially 3. So even though it's a tertiary priority, it's only because I feel like conditioning has more of an impact than strength does in the program. So our gym sessions will last between 45 minutes to an hour 15. The guys will come in and do some mobility specific to boxing, looking at ankle, hip, thoracic spine, shoulder. Do some pre-activation work if they've got anything particularly that we feel they need to kind of get a little bit of exposure to. Then they'll go into a big key lift, whether it's we really value squatting, we really value trap bar, deadlifting, to get some kind of global loading across the body. And also the boxers that we're working with really value seeing those numbers and the way they feel off the back of the session after doing that. Then in our ancillary work, we'll target those particular key areas that we feel are really important, whether it's to do with ankle stiffness, and we might put that in before the squatting, or lat development for any of our guys, grip and trunk, ancillary supporting areas that we focus on a lot. But again, one of the things that perhaps is different in my situation to your listeners is that we're programming for kind of 45 boxers at any one time, plus or minus 5.
Yeah.
So it's a really high volume scale program, but it's a squad, so it's not necessarily a team where we can be generic. Like, one of the things that we really focus on is making sure that every boxer has an individual support package around them, because boxing's an individual sport.
Yeah.
So hopefully I haven't given too much of a rambling answer on what the gym session looks like, because in my head all of the different boxes have got a slightly different structure and pattern depending on what they're trying to achieve.
Yeah, that's why I mentioned it was a very general comment, because obviously it changes depending who it is, where you are in the year and things like that too.
But again, like, the premise is adaptation focus. So what does that guy need? Do they need to watch their weight? Do we need to make sure we're minimising hypertrophy? If that's the case, we might do 2 or 3 sets of an exercise, 3 to 5 reps, and we never go above 5 reps. We might prioritise using isometrics in key positions, because the likelihood of stimulating hypertrophy in these guys is reduced in that way. If somebody's trying to bulk up because they're changing weight class, and like in Olympic boxing at the moment, with weight classes being redistributed between men and women, and some weight classes in the men's side disappearing, like, we've got a few guys we're working with at the moment to support changing in weight class. We might do a big bulky, like, some of the guys have a little play with some German volume training at weekends, which is brutal but really effective. And some of the guys will do kind of a 5.5s, 5.8s, 5.10s, 5.12s type progression through like a hypertrophy block with limited rest. But I think a key underpinning factor to all of the programming is, like, I really believe, like, there's 3 underpinning drivers to physical change: consistency, frequency, and intent. Like, I'm lucky, like, our guys' consistency and frequency, they're training a lot all the time because they're full-time. I think a challenge for kind of listeners at home who are managing their training around full-time work is, like, consistency is better than inconsistency. So how can you be consistent with your training? How can you be frequent with your training? And then how do you bring your absolute maximum A game and intent to everything you're doing? So, James, if you came and had a look in our gym sessions, you would think it's an absolute mess, because the guys are having chit-chats everywhere, they're having a little bit of fun and a laugh.
That's how I used to run mine too, so it's I wouldn't think it's a mess. That's how I like mine with the rugby guys.
I like to think of it as organised chaos, because the guys, when they're not on the bar, they're enjoying the space, enjoying the environment. But when they're on the bar, and when they know what they're trying, when they've got 4 sets of 5 that they need to achieve on a specific rest period, they're on the bar, they're focused, and they're getting the work done really well. And I think frequency, consistency, intent in training are those 3 underpinning things which get overlooked all the time, but actually the guys that are listening in, guys and girls that are listening in, could really, really benefit from just giving themselves a pat on the back for a lot of the time, because it goes overlooked when we're talking about like science of stuff and all of the sexy bits that we could add into programming.
Yeah, no, I fully agree with you. Like, to me, consistency is number one. If you're consistent, and even if you do things suboptimal or whatever you want to call it, you're going to make progress just because you're doing it over and over and over again.
It's a really interesting one, isn't it? Because I'm in such a multifaceted, dynamic, changing environment all the time, with all the different things going on within the human body that can change a click of a finger. It's really difficult to say that any situation is like truly optimal.
For sure.
So one of the things, like, and it's perhaps a little bit philosophical, but one of the things that I battle with a little bit sometimes is, okay, we've got loads of information about averages from research, so the average change in this or that. I mean, I end up working with creating unique individuals. Like, the whole point of an Olympic medalist is it's somebody who is not in any way normal, where they're an anomaly. And so how much can we hang our hat on research based on, like, kind of working towards finding an average and perhaps sometimes cutting off the anomalies when we're trying to develop like an anomalous performance?
Yeah, for sure.
But anyway, that's a rabbit hole for not for today.
No, fair enough. I wanted to continue on the strength training discussion on how it changes as you get closer to competition, because I think a lot of people listening, you know, maybe they follow some kind of strength training program or do it themselves, but don't really change it. They kind of maybe just stop 2 weeks out and just don't do anything. So I'd like to hear how you guys, I guess, manage that as you get closer to competition.
Yeah, brilliant. So as a context, that we have guys that will box up to like 16 to 20 bouts in a year because of the competition structure and stuff. So they're competing a lot. In a perfect world, we'll have a good long time to know when they're going out to competition, but often we might get 3 to 5 weeks notice. For us, for major competitions, we'll get a little bit longer and we can put a plan in place. But we have a 5-week prep and a 3-week prep that we roll out just in case. And what that looks like is, on the strength side, the guys will tend to be doing something a little bit more voluminous when they're outside of that, unless we're pushing a specific change outside of a competition prep. But we'll follow a really, really simple traditional progression of reducing volume and increasing intensity in the gym. We'll go from slow to fast progressions. So in the final 2 weeks of a prep, the guys will touch a little bit of max force at a slow way, in a slow movement, almost as a pseudo potentiation. And then they'll spend a good portion of their session in light, fast, explosive movement patterns. And there's nothing sexy about what we do. Like, actually, volume and intensity drop is as much of a textbook approach as we can take. We also periodise the conditioning down on that as well. So as I mentioned, like, the guys do 1 sprint session a week. They'll do probably 2 or 3 other running-based conditioning sessions if we can. And I'm not necessarily tied to running, but one thing that our coaches hold really strongly is that running is really, really important for boxing. And it'd be really easy for me to come and change the system or try and change the system, but I haven't worked out why running is really important for boxing yet. And if I don't understand why it's important, I can't really justify changing it. But we have a periodization pattern where we'll build in from kind of fartlet work in our intervals, down into some kind of short, intense 1 and 3K efforts, because we use 1 and 3K as our testing modes for conditioning. And we do that, or tend to do our testing kind of in the final 2 weeks of camp prep.
Okay.
So that we're capturing an idea of what that athlete is achieving at their best possible state. And we use testing within the training to be able to manage the volume and intensity of what's going on. So super duper simple across either a 5-week block or a 3-week block, depending on how much notice the guys get before they go out to competition.
Yeah, it's always a give and take with coaches as well. Like, you can't come in and just change the way things are done. As whoever then coached you, you lose the buy-in with the coaches and you can't get anything else done.
Yeah, I mean, let's take the example of, like, let's say that I didn't value running because we get loads of running-based injuries. So that's a really big problem because it's non-sport specific modality and we're creating injuries from it. So I come in and try and bulldoze the running prescription at a program that's been successful across 3 Olympic cycles and move it onto some other general mode of conditioning. If I don't understand why it works or why that running prescription has worked, I'm not on a good footing to be able to suggest anything else to be able to be better. So I might think that my suggestions are the sensiblest, most optimal approach, but if I don't have all of the information that the coaches have or everybody else has, then how can us as sports scientists ever really, really, truly be sure that we're right? I don't know. I like Star Wars. You watch Star Wars?
I've watched Star Wars, but I can't say that I like it.
Well, there's a line in that I apply to everything that I'm doing in S&C, and it's basically when this will bore you, but some of your listeners might enjoy it. So, Obi-Wan Kenobi realizes Anakin Skywalker is evil, and he's Darth Vader when he starts talking in absolutes, and he says, only the Sith talk in absolutes. And I think that rings really true in a lot of what we do. Like, there's nothing that we can say that we can absolutely be absolutely nailed on for every single individual we work with. We can try and offer ideas as to what might be the most likely way of getting better, or the most likely way to kind of get a benefit from the training. But I disagree with anyone who thinks they can be absolutely nailed on certain that they're going to be able to do something.
Yeah, and there's always context as well, right? Like, for example, with the running, like, maybe for someone in the example I gave who's boxing 3-4 times a week, maybe running isn't the best option. Maybe they could be doing something like shadow boxing, whatever, and improving their technique while getting the conditioning stimulus instead of running, versus guys like your guys who are training 3 times a day. You know, they probably need time away from boxing to do something else for that conditioning element. So there's always context, you know, within that.
And it's the idea of the compromise. What are you happy to compromise? Like, if you're doing conditioning using shadow work and trying to develop technically, then you're always going to compromise a little bit on both the technical and the conditioning side. Unless you have a real bias towards shadowing for conditioning, in which case the technique might fall apart and you lose your shape and control. And I think sometimes it's making the educated choice of, am I happy to make that compromise? Like, if I've only got 4 sessions a week to be able to do all my training, is that a good compromise for me for one of my sessions because they're so valuable? And is that adaptations like that important? And like, it's always a bit of a game of compromise and where we're happy to flex and where we're happy to push forward.
Yeah, no, for sure. That's a great way to end this podcast too. But if anyone wants to find you, Gary, look at what you're doing, see anything you're posting on the internet, where can they find you?
I kind of tend to dip in and out of socials. So, I mean, people are more than welcome to email me if they want to. My email address is gary.hutt@eistowin.co.uk. I sometimes drop a comment or two on Twitter. I watch everybody else doing stuff that's really cool on Instagram, but I'm not cool enough for Instagram. The boxers take the mickey out of me because I don't know how to. I can't get my head around Snapchat and all those young kids stuff now.
No, I'm not on Snapchat either. Flag that.
Like, I'm really open if anyone wants to DM or kind of like any of those things.
Perfect. I'll put those in the description anyway, so if anyone wants to get in touch with Gary, they can do that there. But thanks for coming on, Gary. I really appreciate it.
No worries, James. Thanks for inviting me. And just a little point at the end, like, your content is absolutely brilliant, mate. I've really enjoyed picking through the last couple of the last couple of weeks, picking through your back catalogue of podcasts. You got some excellent guests.
Thank you.
Keep up the great work, mate.
Thank you. I appreciate it.